The crash of UPS Flight 2976 in November 2025 in Louisville shocked many people because no one believed a modern cargo aircraft could explode only seconds after takeoff. But this was not the first time a UPS Airlines aircraft was involved in a deadly accident. In 2013, UPS Flight 1354 became the first fatal crash in the company's history, even though investigators confirmed that the Airbus A300 had no mechanical problems at all.
Near miss for families inside their homes near an airport as a giant cargo plane came in for a landing and crashed in Alabama.
The painful and surprising truth is that these two disasters, separated by more than a decade, both came from failures that should have been stopped much earlier. So what really happened inside the cockpit of UPS Flight 1354? If you stay until the end of this video, you will learn the real reason these UPS aircraft went down and the hidden piece of the puzzle that went unnoticed for many years. UPS Flight 1354 began as an ordinary cargo flight, yet it would become a turning point in the history of American aviation. On August 14, 2013, the aircraft lifted off from Louisville under calm skies, carrying packages that were meant for overnight delivery in Birmingham, Alabama. The flight operated on an Airbus A300 600F, a workhorse in the cargo world with decades of service behind it, and the crew expected a short trip with no major challenges. The pilots were experienced aviators who had flown similar routes many times, and the aircraft had passed all safety checks before departure. Nothing in the early minutes of the flight suggested that danger was waiting ahead. As the jet approached Birmingham before sunrise, the mood inside the cockpit shifted from routine to tension. The city was still covered in darkness, and the airport sat in a small valley surrounded by uneven terrain that was difficult to judge without visual cues. Weather reports mentioned clouds hanging low above the field, and the crew understood that they would need to complete a non-precision approach instead of using a full instrument landing system. This type of approach gave them fewer tools to guide the aircraft, which meant the final moments of the descent had to be flown with great precision. The runway they were heading toward was runway 18, a shorter runway that lacked the same level of automation found at larger airports, and this placed even more responsibility on the pilots. When the aircraft descended through the final 1,000 feet, the crew searched for the runway lights through the clouds, hoping to make visual contact in time. Instead of seeing the familiar glow, they remained inside a wall of darkness, unaware of how close they were to the ground. The jet continued forward until it reached a sloping area just 1.6 kilometers from the start of the runway, and the left wing struck trees that were hidden in the night. Within seconds, the cargo plane broke apart and exploded in a burst of fire, leaving no chance for survival. Both pilots lost their lives, and investigators arrived to find a scene that raised more questions than answers. The aircraft showed no sign of mechanical failure, and the engines had been producing normal power before impact. There were no warnings of a system malfunction, no structural problems, and no fuel issues. This created an unsettling mystery, because accidents that happen so close to the runway often involve either severe weather or major mechanical failure, yet neither one was present that morning. The crash shocked the aviation community, especially because UPS Airlines had never experienced a fatal accident before this event. Many pilots described the loss as a wake-up call, since it proved that even a short flight with a healthy aircraft could end in disaster if one part of the process went wrong. Federal investigators launched a full inquiry, reviewing flight data, cockpit conversations, dispatch records, weather reports, maintenance logs, and internal UPS policies. They searched for clues that could explain how a fully functioning aircraft, flown by trained professionals, could descend below a safe altitude without any corrective action. The investigation also reached into the structure of the cargo industry, revealing pressures that did not exist in the same way for passenger airlines, such as constant overnight work, fewer automated systems at secondary airports, and heavier use of older aircraft. As the evidence gathered, a new picture began to form, one that showed the crash was not a random event, but part of a larger pattern involving fatigue, rushed planning, and gaps in communication. The aircraft did not fall because of a sudden failure. It fell because many small factors worked together at the worst possible moment. This realization forced investigators to look more closely at the approach itself and to rethink how non-precision approaches can become dangerous when even one detail is missed. And from this moment on, investigators shifted their focus to the approach itself because the descent path revealed patterns that would soon expose the true technical mistakes behind the crash. The main problem behind UPS Flight 1354 began with an unstable approach, which is one of the most dangerous situations in aviation because it pushes the crew into a tight window of decisions during the final moments of a flight. A stable approach must follow clear limits for speed, altitude, and descent angle, yet the aircraft drifted below its safe path long before the pilots realized the danger. Non-precision approaches demand even more attention since they do not give pilots the full electronic guidance that an instrument landing system normally provides. This means the crew must calculate the descent path on their own, using visual cues and simple reference points that can disappear easily in dark or cloudy conditions. The early descent of Flight 1354 showed how quickly a small deviation can grow into a serious threat when the airport environment gives almost no visual help. Investigators discovered that the Airbus A300-600F carried several limitations that made this type of approach harder than on newer aircraft. The jet did not have an integrated vertical navigation function, so the crew could not rely on an automated descent profile that modern systems generate for precision. Instead, they had to manage altitude changes manually, which required constant monitoring of their position relative to the minimum descent altitude. The flight management system also came from an older generation, and this system would not guide the aircraft down unless the crew removed every discontinuity in the programmed route. When one of these discontinuities remained active during the approach, the aircraft continued on a fixed level and did not adjust its altitude for the descent. This behavior forced the pilots to change altitude on their own, which added more workload at a time when every second mattered. As the aircraft approached Birmingham, the crew began descending earlier than recommended, and the lack of clear runway lights made it difficult to judge how low they had gone. The minimum descent altitude existed to prevent exactly this situation, yet the pilots went below it while still inside the clouds, unaware of how close they were to the hillside ahead. The stall warning never activated, and the engines continued producing normal thrust, which meant the aircraft remained fully under control and capable of climbing at any moment. This is why the crash was labeled a controlled flight into terrain, a rare but deadly event where a perfectly functioning aircraft is flown into the ground because the crew loses awareness of their surroundings. Flight data showed the aircraft sinking at a steep rate that should have triggered an immediate go-around, but no such action occurred. The pilots continued searching for the runway, believing they were higher than they actually were, and this misjudgment carried them directly into the slope below the threshold. The accident proved that even experienced crews can fall into a dangerous trap when manual approaches combine with limited visibility and older automation. Modern jets often prevent this outcome by giving pilots altitude warnings or by creating an automated glide path. Yet the Airbus A300-600F lacked these features, which left the crew with fewer safeguards. This weakness became a key part of the investigation because it revealed how outdated systems can magnify small errors until they become irreversible. The unstable approach was only one layer of the problem, and investigators soon realized that the condition of the crew played an equally important role in the chain of events. The next part of the story uncovers how fatigue and overnight schedules silently shaped every decision in the cockpit. Fatigue became one of the most important factors in the crash of UPS Flight 1354 because tired pilots can lose awareness even when every system on the aircraft is working correctly. The captain had been sleeping in short and irregular patterns for several days, which prevented his body from entering full rest cycles, and this condition weakened his ability to judge altitude and speed during the approach. The first officer was in an even worse state, since she had reported feeling extremely tired before the flight and had struggled to stay awake on a previous leg earlier that night. When both pilots share this level of exhaustion, their communication slows down and their decision-making becomes less reliable, especially during complex approaches in darkness. Studies from aviation safety groups show that severe fatigue can reduce a pilot's awareness as much as mild alcohol consumption, and this effect appears most clearly during night operations. Cargo crews often work through the late hours when the rest of the airport is quiet and their internal clocks shift away from the rhythm that keeps most people alert. The environment of overnight flying also adds pressure, since there are fewer support staff available and fewer aircraft in the area that could provide visual reference points. In the cockpit of Flight 1354, the pilots began to show signs of narrowed attention, a condition sometimes called tunnel vision, where the mind focuses on one task while ignoring critical information around it. This effect made it harder for them to notice that they were descending too early, and their ability to cross-check each other weakened because both were fighting the same physical limits. Recordings revealed moments where the crew spoke about how tired they felt, which showed that fatigue was not hidden but was openly affecting their performance while they continued the approach. Many safety experts point out that such admissions are warning signs, since pilots rarely talk about exhaustion unless it has reached a point where thinking clearly becomes difficult. The policies within the cargo industry make this problem more complicated because pilots often hesitate to declare themselves unfit due to concerns about losing pay or disrupting tightly packed schedules. UPS pilots had expressed similar worries in union discussions, explaining that calling in tired could reduce certain incentives, which discouraged open communication about rest needs. This environment contributes to a cycle where crews push themselves through demanding flights, even when their minds and bodies are not ready for the challenges ahead. The crash of Flight 1354 reflected this pattern, since the crew continued the descent even as their performance slipped below normal professional standards, not because they lacked skill, but because their bodies were too tired to respond with full accuracy. Fatigue also affects memory recall, which may explain why the pilots missed certain callouts and did not take actions that would normally be routine, such as maintaining the minimum descent altitude. The final minutes of the flight showed a quiet breakdown of teamwork, where neither pilot corrected the other's mistakes and both seemed to believe the runway was closer than it actually was. This combination of overloaded senses and reduced awareness created a dangerous situation that unfolded without any mechanical warnings, which is why investigators considered fatigue a major contributor to the tragedy. The deeper question, however, was how such conditions were allowed to develop inside a professional airline environment. That question led investigators to examine dispatch communication, weather updates, and misinterpreted airport information, which opened the door to the next layer of the chain. The investigation into UPS Flight 1354 revealed that several gaps in communication made the approach far more dangerous than the crew realized, because critical information did not reach them in a clear or timely way. The dispatch team preparing the flight failed to highlight that runway 6, the only runway with full instrument guidance, was closed during the arrival window, and this detail should have changed how the pilots planned their descent. Without that runway available, the crew was forced to use a non-precision procedure on runway 18, which required a higher amount of manual control and closer attention to altitude restrictions. Dispatchers normally alert crews when an airport loses an essential capability, yet in this case the closure appeared inside routine notices that were easy to overlook during a busy shift. Notices to airmen, which are used to inform pilots about changes to airport conditions, added confusion because the entry describing the night restrictions for the approach was written in a way that invited misinterpretation. The line stating that the approach was not authorized at night did not clearly explain which part of the procedure was unavailable, and this caused uncertainty about what the crew could expect during the final descent. Pilots often describe NOTAMs as difficult to read because they contain long blocks of text packed with abbreviations, and this layout forces crews to interpret important instructions while also managing their flight duties. Weather information introduced another layer of trouble since the automatic broadcast system for the airport failed to mention that the ceiling varied down to 600 feet, which was low enough to hide terrain until the last moment. This missing detail made the environment appear safer than it actually was, and it influenced how the pilots judged their altitude while descending through the early morning clouds. Accidents in aviation often show that poor communication can be just as dangerous as mechanical failure, because pilots make decisions based on the information they receive, and any gap in that chain increases the risk of a wrong action. The case of Flight 1354 demonstrated how easily a small misunderstanding can grow when several weak points line up at the same time, especially when the aircraft is already following a more difficult approach. Investigators also compared this situation to other major incidents where outdated or incomplete notices contributed to dangerous outcomes, such as the near miss of Air Canada 759, when the crew nearly landed on a taxiway because NOTAMs failed to explain construction changes clearly. Another example came from American Airlines 1420, where severe weather information did not reach the pilots quickly enough, and the crew attempted a rushed landing that ended in disaster. These comparisons helped investigators understand that Flight 1354 was not the result of a single bad decision, but part of a wider issue in aviation communication that continues to affect pilots around the world. The errors in dispatch, NOTAM interpretation, and weather reporting created a chain of confusion that shaped the decisions in the cockpit because the crew believed conditions were more stable than they truly were. With those misunderstandings in place, the pilots entered the final descent without full awareness of the risks ahead, and this lack of clarity became a silent force that pushed the flight toward its tragic ending. This part of the story led investigators to examine similar tragedies in aviation history, where approach errors and miscommunication worked together in deadly ways. Understanding those older cases became essential because they revealed patterns that matched the problems seen in Flight 1354. A deeper look at UPS Flight 1354 shows that its mistakes were not isolated, because many earlier crashes shared the same pattern of unstable approaches and misjudged decisions near the runway. A clear example of this connection appears in the crash of Asiana Airlines Flight 214, which happened during a clear day in San Francisco when the crew relied too heavily on automation. The pilots assumed the aircraft's auto throttle would control speed during descent, yet it did not activate correctly, and this misunderstanding caused the jet to fall below its intended path and strike the seawall before the runway. Investigators explained that the crew expected the system to fix their mistake, but the aircraft needed manual correction, and this delay created a dangerous situation that ended in a violent impact. This incident became a strong reminder that even modern jets can behave unpredictably when pilots expect technology to solve problems that require human control. Another example comes from the crash of American Airlines Flight 1420 in Little Rock, where the crew faced a severe thunderstorm during their approach and struggled to manage the aircraft in heavy wind and rain. The pilots continued the landing even though the weather had changed rapidly, and the jet touched down at high speed before sliding off the runway into a structure near the airfield. Investigators later said the approach became unstable long before touchdown, but the crew pressed on because they were trying to land before a duty time limit ended. This pressure created a risky situation in which the crew felt they had to continue, and this emotional weight shaped their decisions at a critical moment. Korean Air Flight 801 adds another layer to this pattern, because it crashed into terrain near Guam during a nighttime approach when the glide slope system was not available. The crew descended below the safe altitude while trying to find visual cues, and this mistake placed the aircraft directly in the path of rising ground. The impact killed most of the passengers, and the tragedy later showed how difficult it is to judge height and distance in darkness without instrument guidance. These older cases help explain why UPS Flight 1354 followed a familiar pattern, because each accident shares the same structure of reduced visibility, complex approaches, and crews who misjudged altitude during the most dangerous part of flight. The similarities become even clearer when comparing the environment the UPS pilots faced, as they were flying into early morning darkness with limited visual references and without full instrument support for the runway they used. A non-precision procedure demands strict attention to altitude checks, and any small misstep becomes harder to recover from when the terrain rises quickly near the airport. This condition resembles the challenges faced by the Korean air crew and the Asiana team, because all three flights underestimated how quickly a stable approach can turn unsafe. Human performance also plays a key role in these accidents, since fatigue, stress, and rushed thinking can turn simple tasks into complex challenges, and these factors showed up repeatedly across the major cases in aviation history. Investigators often conclude that most approach accidents begin long before the aircraft reaches the runway, because small misjudgments pile up until the crew can no longer correct them. This pattern continued with Flight 1354, which descended below the minimum altitude while the pilots were still trying to find the runway in low visibility and limited light. By the time they noticed how fast the ground was rising toward them, the aircraft had already passed the point where a safe climb could be achieved. These comparisons prove that UPS 1354 did not happen in isolation, because it followed a set of mistakes and pressures already known to investigators from years of earlier tragedies. The long history of unstable approaches shows that the final minutes of flight are often the most dangerous, and flight crews must manage a mix of speed, altitude, visibility, and judgments under stress. The lessons from past tragedies shape how the industry understands modern aviation risks, and these lessons reveal why Flight 1354 fits into a broader pattern that still challenges pilots today. This connection between earlier disasters and the UPS crash leads to another important question about how UPS Airlines handles risk in its own operations. Understanding that internal environment becomes essential when looking at the company's other major accidents. UPS Airlines has faced several major accidents across different years, and each one reveals how cargo operations carry unique risks that often stay hidden until a crisis appears. One of the most tragic events happened in 2025 when UPS Flight 2976 crashed shortly after takeoff from Louisville. The left engine separated from the wing as the aircraft accelerated, and the fire that followed spread faster than the crew could control. 14 people died, including workers on the ground, and investigators later discovered that a tiny crack inside the pylon had survived years of inspections without being detected. This failure showed how older aircraft can hide dangerous weaknesses deep inside the metal, especially when maintenance schedules depend heavily on visual checks instead of advanced scanning. Another major accident occurred in 2010 when UPS Flight 6 caught fire shortly after departing from Dubai, and the smoke filled the cockpit so quickly that the pilots struggled to read their instruments. Lithium batteries in the cargo ignited during the climb, and the crew lost the ability to see as the heat destroyed key systems. The aircraft crashed near an airbase, and the investigation led to new global rules about how hazardous cargo must be handled. UPS Flight 1307 in 2006 adds one more layer to this pattern because it also faced a serious cargo fire that forced the crew to perform an emergency landing in Philadelphia. The pilots survived, but the event highlighted how fast a fire can spread inside a sealed compartment when smoke detection and suppression systems reach their limits. Across these events, several themes repeat themselves, and they paint a clear picture of how cargo airlines face different pressures than passenger carriers. Cargo flights often operate at night, which increases pilot fatigue and reduces visibility during approaches, and many aircraft used in this sector rely on older design structures with limited automation support. Maintenance cycles for cargo fleets also vary widely because planes spend more hours on the ground loading freight, and this schedule sometimes delays deeper inspections. These repeated risks show that UPS Flight 1354 was not the result of individual mistakes alone, because it grew from operational habits that shaped the entire company. This understanding sets the stage for the final conclusion, where all the pieces come together to explain what these accidents reveal about air safety and how the industry must change to prevent future tragedies. The crash of UPS Flight 1354 shows how an accident can happen even when the aircraft has no technical problems, because small errors, tired crews, and missing information can build up fast. When we compare it with the crashes of 2,976 Flight 6 and other UPS incidents, we see the same risks return again and again. These events remind us that real safety comes from careful decisions, strong training, and better support for the people who fly.